He didn't rescue them dramatically. He simply opened a door and waited. The well rope had frayed down to maybe 4 good strands, and I was 30 feet up on the crossbeam with a new length of hemp coiled over my shoulder when I heard the wagon. Not the sound of it, the sound of what was wrong with it. Left rear wheel had a wobble, the kind that starts slow and ends fast, and whoever was driving hadn't noticed or didn't know what to do about it. I stayed up there and watched it come down the road. Small wagon, mule, not a horse. Canvas sides that had been patched twice at least, different colors of thread. A woman driving, her back straight the way people hold themselves straight when they're too tired to be tired anymore, when tired is just the shape they've taken. A child beside her, 7 or 8, sitting with both hands in her lap and watching the mule's ears. They turned at my gate. I came down off the crossbeam and coiled the rope over the post and walked to meet them at the edge of the yard, wiping my hands on my trousers. The woman pulled up and looked at me without any kind of apology on her face, which I respected. She said her name was Clara Marsh. She said she'd been told in Dunmore that a man named Aldous kept a place out this way, that he took in seasonal help in exchange for room and a share of the table. She said she could cook and mend, and had done ranch work before and wasn't afraid of it. I looked at the wheel. The iron ring had worked loose and was sitting crooked, another quarter-mile from falling off entirely. I said, "I'm Aldous." She waited. I said, "You got a bad wheel on the left rear." She said she knew. I said, "Drive it easy around to the barn, and I'll look at it before the light goes." That was the beginning of it, not any kind of dramatic thing. I fixed the wheel. She cooked supper. The girl, whose name was Nettie, ate 2 bowls of beans and didn't say much but watched everything with the kind of eyes that take inventory and don't give anything back. After supper, I showed Clara the bunkhouse out back where the seasonal men slept in summer, said it was hers and Nettie's, that there was a bolt on the inside of the door and a wood stove in the corner. She looked at the bolt for a moment, said thank you, and meant it the particular way people mean it when they've needed a thing badly for a while and finally found it. I didn't ask what they were coming from. I figured it would come or it wouldn't. This was late September. The cold was already sliding down off the high ground at night, carrying the smell of something turning. I had 140 head of cattle spread across 3 pastures and a fence line on the North 40 that had been giving me trouble since July, and a man named Hobe Pritchard who worked for me full-time and was good with horses but better at finding reasons to leave early on Fridays. So the help was real. I wasn't doing Clara any charity. That matters to me, the accounting of a thing. I needed the work done and she could do it. She could do it and then some. First week she reorganized the kitchen so that everything I'd been losing for 6 years was suddenly where it ought to be. And she did it without saying a word about the state I'd let it get into, which told me something. She had the cast iron clean in a way I hadn't managed since my wife Ruth passed. She put up the remaining garden before the frost took it. I'd been watching the squash and the last of the pole beans and meaning to get to it, and not getting to it. And she put Nettie to work alongside her like it was ordinary, like that's what mornings were for. They moved through the garden with a kind of quiet economy that made you not want to interrupt it. I found myself not going inside until supper was nearly on. Hobe took one look at the situation and decided he had opinions. He said so on a Thursday afternoon while we were restringing wire on the north fence, said it sideways the way Hobe said everything, talking at the wire instead of at me. Said it was unusual, a woman set up like that. Said people in town were bound to talk. I pulled the wire through the staple and crimped it and said, people in town can go to hell. Hobe didn't say anything else about it. What he didn't know, what I didn't know yet, was what had put Clara on that road to begin with. She told me in pieces over the following weeks, not as a confession, more like things that surfaced when the work was quiet and she wasn't watching herself. Her husband had died a year and a half back. A sickness that took 3 months and left them with nothing but the debt. She'd stayed in Lubbock another 8 months trying to hold it together, taking in washing, sewing for the preacher's wife, whatever came. But the house was the bank's, and then it wasn't available, and then a cousin in Flagstaff wrote and said, "Come if you need to." And she'd sold what little was left and pointed the mule west, and the mule had gotten her this far and then the wheel. She said it without self-pity, just the order of facts, the way you'd describe whether that had passed through. I listened, didn't say anything that I didn't mean, didn't tell her it would be fine because I didn't know that it would. October came in hard. The cold settled down into the ground and the creek dropped to a thin, cold thread, and I had to start breaking ice at the water troughs every morning before the cattle could drink. Nettie started coming with me. I don't know when that started. One morning she was just there, her breath coming in small puffs, pulling her coat tight. I didn't say anything about it. I handed her the mallet and showed her how to hit the corner of the ice first where it was thinnest, and she did it with a serious concentration that was almost funny and mostly not. She wasn't a child who laughed easily. She had her mother's way of watching things first, deciding later. We started talking on those mornings, not about anything much. The cattle mostly, which ones I'd named and which ones I hadn't and why. She had opinions about the names. She said I ought not to have named the big brindle steer Gerald because Gerald was a name for a man who worked in a bank, not for a steer. I said it was the name that came when I looked at him. She considered that seriously and said, "All right, but if he does something impressive maybe you could give him a better name." I said, "What kind of impressive?" She said she hadn't decided yet. I thought about Ruth a lot in those weeks, not with the old sharpness that had dulled down into something more like a steady low weight, but in a different way, a noticing way. Ruth would have liked Nettie. That was the thought that kept coming. Ruth would have sat with her at the table and done arithmetic problems for fun, which was the kind of woman Ruth was, which is why I married her, which is why 18 years of living next to that particular kind of person leaves you very specifically alone when she's gone. I wasn't looking for another Ruth. I wasn't looking for anything, but I thought she would have liked the girl. The second week of October, I rode into Dunmore for supplies, and Len Caffrey at the hardware pulled me aside and said a man had been through asking about a woman and a girl in a small wagon with a canvas-patched cover. Said he was the woman's brother-in-law, here to bring her back. Said it the way a man says something he thinks is a favor, like he was passing useful news. I bought my supplies and rode back and didn't say anything that night. But I took stock of what I had. The Winchester over the door, a Colt I'd kept oiled and loaded since Ruth died in the drawer of the side table, more for habit than for purpose. The lock on the barn. The lay of the property, where a man coming up the road could be seen from 600 yards if you were at the right window. I've never been a man who does things dramatically. I've been doing the same things on this piece of ground for 22 years, and most of what those years taught me is that the dramatic thing is usually the wrong one. Water the horse before you water yourself. Fix the fence before the cattle find the gap. When there's trouble coming, see it early and be already standing in the right place before it arrives. He came on a Saturday. I'd half expected it to be midweek when the hands weren't around, but it was a Saturday noon, which told me he wasn't especially smart. Hobe had gone to town. Nettie was in the barn with the barn cat who'd had a litter in the feed room, which she'd appointed herself guardian of. I was splitting wood by the south side of the house when I saw the dust. Clara came out of the kitchen and stood on the step. I set them all down against the block and said, "Go inside and stay there until I come for you." She said, "That'll be Devin." I said, "Yes." She said, "He doesn't mean well." I said, "I know, go inside." She looked at me for a moment, not like she doubted me. Like she was reading something, making sure it was what she thought it was. Then she went inside. He was a big man on a sorrel horse, mid-30s, soft around the middle in the way of a man who does his hard work by getting other people to do it. He had a new hat and old boots, which tells you the order of his priorities. He rode into the yard like he expected someone to take his horse. I stood where I was. He said, "I'm looking for Clara Marsh." I'm her brother-in-law, Devin Poole. I've come to bring her back to Lubbock." I said, "She doesn't want to go." He said, "I didn't ask what she wanted." I said, "I know you didn't." He looked at me like he was measuring whether I'd be trouble, which is always a mistake in a man's eyes when he's measuring the wrong thing. He said she was his brother's wife and her obligation was to stay near family, and if she had a notion to stay out here with some old rancher, then she had another thing coming. He said it without heat, like it was just the order of things and I was an inconvenience. I said, "She's not going back to Lubbock." He said, "You don't have any say in that." I said, "She's got work here and a roof and a bolt on her door and nobody who talks to her the way you just said that. So no, she's not going." He sat there on the sorrel and thought about what to do with that. I could see him deciding. And then he reached toward the saddlebag, and I didn't move fast. I never move fast. I just reached into the pocket of my coat where I'd put the Colt that morning because I'd seen the dust early and been in the right place. And I said, "Don't. Just that, don't." He stopped. I said, "This is my land, and you came on it uninvited, and you're going to go off it the same way." He wanted to push it. I could see that too. But a man looking down the line of a Colt held by a man who isn't moving, who isn't breathing hard, who looks like he's done this before whether he has or he hasn't, that's a specific kind of steady that talks. He wheeled the sorrel and went. I stayed in the yard until the dust settled. Then I put the Colt back in my coat and went to the woodpile and picked up the maul and split 3 more pieces of wood because my hands needed something to do, and that's what was there. Clara came out when I knocked. She looked at me and I said, "He's gone." She nodded once. She'd been crying but was done with it or done enough. She said, "He'll be back." I said, "Maybe." She said, "You know he will." I said, "Then I'll be here." She looked at me a long time after that. Long enough that it started to feel like something, which I didn't know what to do with. So I said I'd better check on Nettie, and I went to the barn. Nettie was sitting in the feed room with 3 kittens in her lap and the mother cat watching from the top of the grain bin. She said, "I heard." I said, "How much?" She said, "Enough." She looked at the kittens and then at me and said, "Is my mother all right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you?" I said, "I'm all right." She said, "Okay," and went back to the kittens. I'm not sure what I expected from that exchange. I don't know that I expected anything. But I walked back to the house with something sitting in my chest that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anything I had a name for. November. Devin Poole didn't come back. Whether that was because he thought better of it or because word got around that the man out at the Aldous place wasn't someone to push, I don't know. Could have been either. Could have been both. Either way, the road stayed quiet and we settled into the rhythm of winter. Winter on a ranch is its own animal. The work doesn't stop, it narrows and gets harder. The cattle cluster near the feed grounds and you haul hay until your shoulders won't unclench at night. The water troughs need breaking twice a day in a hard freeze. The horses need more feed and more time, and the barn needs the gaps stuffed before the cold finds a way to kill something. It's not romantic work. It's not even interesting most of the time. It's just necessary, and you do it the same way you've done it for 22 years, and there's a kind of dignity in that if you look for it. Clara looked for it. She was up before first light every morning, and I'd see the lamp in the kitchen when I came across from the bunkhouse, which is where I'd started sleeping more often than the house, giving them the space. She put oatmeal on and coffee, and I'd come in and eat without ceremony, and then we'd go out to the morning work, sometimes together, sometimes apart, but always both. The girl went to the school in Dunmore when the road permitted it, Tuesdays and Thursdays when Hobe could take her in the wagon. On the other days she did her lessons at the kitchen table while her mother worked, and sometimes I'd sit across from her after supper, and she'd read to me from the primer, which she didn't need help with. She was better at it than she let on at school because she was still measuring that place the way she measured everything. One evening she looked up from the primer and said, What was your wife's name? I said Ruth. She said, did she sit here too? I said she did. She thought about that. Then she said, I think that's all right, that we sit here too. I said, yes, I think it is. She went back to reading. I sat there for a while looking at the lamp and the grain of the table and all the small marks Ruth had put in that table over 18 years, the ring from a coffee cup, the nick where she'd been cutting twine and the knife slipped. I wasn't sad the way I'd been sad. It was more like being in a room with something, and knowing it was there and not being unmade by it. December came. The cold got serious. We'd had a fair autumn, enough to put up good stores, and the cattle were holding their weight, and the north fence had stayed sound since I'd fixed it in October. I was in decent shape for a man going into January alone, which I hadn't been in years, which is the kind of thing you don't notice you're managing until something changes the accounting. What I noticed most was the sound of the house. Ruth had been a quiet woman but not a silent one. There was always something, a door, a chair moving, a low singing when she thought I was outside. After she died, the house went silent in a way that was its own presence, a kind of held breath. Now there was Nettie doing her lessons, and Clara's particular way of working in a kitchen that had its own rhythm, a bowl set down carefully, a drawer that caught and she'd learned to lift and push, and in the evenings sometimes the two of them talking low, and I'd be on the other side of the wall and not make out the words but hear the shape of it, which was enough. I started sleeping in the house again in December. It was cold in the bunkhouse, and there was no good reason to freeze myself out of my own home. Clara didn't say anything about it. Neither did Nettie. We arranged ourselves the way people arrange themselves when they've been practical about harder things than where to sleep. We'd taken to sitting after supper, the three of us. I'd have a pipe and they'd do whatever they'd do, sewing or reading or in Nettie's case drawing pictures of the cattle with specific attention to getting Gerald right, which she was still working on. Some nights we talked. Some nights we just sat. I'd forgotten what it was to just sit with people. Somewhere in those 18 years with Ruth it had become so ordinary that I stopped knowing it was a thing, and then she was gone and I knew it was a thing, and now there was this. One night in late December, deep cold, wind off the plain, Clara put her mending down and said, "You didn't have to do what you did with Devon." I said it wasn't a question of having to. She said some men would have let him take us. I said I'm not some men. She looked at me. She had a particular way of looking at a person, Clara did, a steady way that didn't flinch or look around the thing it was looking at. And when she turned it on you, it was like being checked by someone who wasn't checking you out of suspicion, but out of the need to be sure of something. She said, "No, you're not." That sat in the room for a while. The wind pushed at the window glass. The lamp threw its yellow circle. Nettie was asleep in the chair and didn't know any of this was happening. I said, "You've been a help to me, real help. I want you to know that." She said, "You could have hired any man for less trouble." I said I could have. It wouldn't have been the same. She nodded slow, like she was taking that in and deciding what to do with it. I said, "I'm not good at saying things directly." She said, "You're better at it than you think." I said, "I mean." She said, "I know what you mean, Aldous." I didn't say anything else. We sat there a while longer and then she picked her mending back up and I smoked the last of my pipe, and outside the wind kept on, and the cattle in the near pasture made their night sounds, low and steady, the same sounds they made every night, the sounds that meant everything was in order and nothing was coming and we were all, for now, all right. January. A hard month, and I don't mean to make it otherwise. 20 below for 10 days running. One of the young steers lost to the cold before I could get to him. The creek frozen solid and we had to haul water from the cistern by hand, twice a day, 80 yards each way. Hobe's back gave out in the second week, and he was no good for the heavy work, and I didn't fire him because Hobe had his history and I had mine and he'd been solid for 4 years, and a man's back going out in January isn't a character failure. I just did the heavy work myself. Clara hauled water alongside me. Both sides of the yoke, same as I took mine, no argument about it, no waiting to be asked. In weather like that you don't waste breath on conversation. You just work and get warm and work again. But one morning the bad stretch was easing, I could feel it. The air had a different quality. We were coming back from the cistern and she slipped on the ice near the barn door and I caught her, arm around her waist, both of us with full buckets sloshing, her shoulder against my chest, and we just stood there a moment getting our footing. I could feel her breath, the quick catch of it from almost going down. I held on until she was steady and then I let go. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Careful near the barn." She said, "I see that now." But she looked at me when she said it, and I looked back, and it was one of those moments where the looking is the thing, and the words are just the cover for it. February. Hope's back came right, and the weather broke, and the cattle made it through, and Gerald made it through, which Nettie took as evidence of something, though she didn't say what. The days got longer by measurable amounts, and there's nothing on earth that does for a man in winter what that first evening where the sun's still above the ridge when he comes in from the last chore. Nothing that reaches down into the winter-stiff part of you and starts to pull it loose. I was in better shape than I'd been going into winter in years. The cattle healthy, the fences sound, the larder not cleaned out. That's 22 years of knowing how to do it and doing it, and this year doing it with help, and there's a satisfaction in that goes beyond just the accounting. A man who's been working alone on a piece of ground for a long time, when he works alongside someone capable, starts to feel what he's been carrying. Not in a bad way, just a noticing. One Sunday, I fixed the gate latch on the south pasture that had been half broken since October, and I looked up at the house, and Clara was standing on the step watching me in that particular way of hers. And she said nothing and I said nothing, and I finished the latch and went back inside, and that was a whole conversation. We talked about the spring that afternoon, what I'd plant, what I'd leave fallow, where I needed to move the fence line on the west side to make better use of the creek feed. She had thoughts. Practical thoughts, based on what she'd watched all winter, and she was right on a couple of points that I'd been wrong on for years. I didn't make anything of being wrong. I said, "You're right," and she nodded and kept talking. She told me more about Lubbock. Not the hard parts, she'd already told those, but the before. The house they'd had, her husband Thomas, what he'd been like when he was well, which she described carefully and without bitterness. A fair man, she said, a decent man who got sick, and she'd loved him and she was not going to be untrue to that. I said I understood. She said, "I think you do." She said, "Ruth must have been something." I said she was. She said, "You don't talk about her much." I said, "I talk about her when I need to." She said, "That's a good way to do it." We were quiet for a while. The kind of quiet that's comfortable in a kitchen in the afternoon in February, when the light comes in flat and cold, and the stove's ticking and everything outside is waiting for spring. She said, "What happens in spring, with me and Nettie?" I said, "What do you want to happen?" She said, "I'm asking you." I said, "I'd like you to stay. If you want to. There's work here and there'll always be work here, and you've earned your place at this table and Nettie's earned hers," and I stopped. I said, "I'm not saying it right." She said, "You're saying it fine." I said, "I mean that I want you here, both of you, not just for the help." She sat with that, she didn't rush it. I watched her hands on the table, the same hands that had hauled water and fixed harness and braided Nettie's hair every morning, and set plates down in front of me for 5 months like that was something she'd always done. She said, "I think Nettie would be glad." I said, "What about you?" She said, "I think I would be glad too." She didn't say it soft. She said it the way she said everything, straight and considered, like it had been weighed first and this was the conclusion. And then she reached across the table and put her hand over mine, just rested it there, And we sat that way in the flat February light with the stove ticking and the cattle moving in the near pasture, and the rest of the year laid out in front of us like ground we hadn't walked yet but knew how to walk. March. The first real day of spring came on a Wednesday, the kind of day where the air changes and every animal on the place knows it. I was out behind the barn checking the fence posts for heave when Nettie came running from the direction of the schoolhouse, which Hobe had driven her to that morning. She was supposed to be in school until 3, but it was barely noon. I said, "Why are you back?" She said, breathless, her coat half-buttoned, "Mrs. Reeves let us out early because of the weather," which was a thin reason but not impossible. Then she said, "Also, I wanted to ask you something." I said, "Ask." She said, "If you and Mama get married, can I call you Pa, or is that too much?" I stood there with a fence post in my hands. She was watching me with that inventory look, steady and patient, giving me time. I said, "We haven't gotten that far yet." She said, "I know, I'm asking if we get there." I said, "If we get there, yes, you can call me that." She nodded, satisfied, like she'd confirmed something she'd already more or less decided. She said, "Gerald made it all the way through winter." I said, "He did." She said, "I've been thinking and I want to give him a better name for spring." I said, "What name?" She said, "I was thinking Aldous." I looked at her. She said, "It's a good name." She paused. She said, "It's a name for somebody solid." I put the fence post down and I crouched to her level, and I looked at this girl who had come across the winter with her mother in a patched canvas wagon on a bad wheel, and had not complained once, not once, had hauled water and fed cats and done her letters and watched everything and decided carefully, and I said, "That's fine. You can call him that." She nodded. She went off to find the barn cat. I stood up and the spring air was doing what spring air does, which is remind you that the ground is still there, and the season is turning, and the work is waiting, and you had better be ready. I had 38 cows that needed to be checked for pregnancy. I had a fence line to walk. I had seed to order from Dunmore before the good weather brought everyone else's orders in ahead of mine. And I had a woman in the kitchen who'd made up her mind about me the same way she made up her mind about everything, thoroughly and without drama, and a girl in the barn calling a steer by my name like that was just the obvious thing. I walked back to the house. The door was open. It had been closed all winter, that door, and now Clara had left it open to let the March air in, the first warm afternoon of it, and I stood in the doorway for a moment the way the title says, just stood there, not making anything of it. The kitchen smelled like coffee and something baking, and the air behind me smelled like winter leaving, and inside Clara was at the table with the seed catalog I'd left out, making notes on the margin in her careful hand, and she looked up. She said, "You want coffee?" I said, "In a minute." She went back to the catalog. I stood in the doorway a while longer, the land running out to the south in the pale March light, the cattle moving in the lower pasture, the steer that was going to get a new name this week standing apart from the others the way he always did, stubborn and big and still there. 22 years of this ground. Ruth's years and then the years after and now this, which was something else, something I hadn't planned or looked for or earned in any particular dramatic way. Just opened a door. Just let what came come. I went inside and poured my own coffee and sat down across from Clara, and she showed me what she'd circled in the catalog, and I had opinions, and she had better ones, and the door stayed open, and the spring air came in, and that is how it was and how it stayed, and I would not have traded a day of it. Not one.